Good afternoon. I'm Brian McGowan. I'm an Extension Wildlife Specialist at Purdue University. And today's program, we're going to talk a little bit about dealing with mold damage in the yard. And so I have with me online Wendy Mayer. She's our communications coordinator in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at Purdue. And so what I'm going to cover today is talk a little bit about moles and their biology, certainly the types of damage that they do, but most importantly, what we can do about it. And so in doing so, I'm going to try and share a little bit of some of the experiences that I've had over the years, and hopefully you can figure out what's right for you and try that at home. Just want to let you know that as we go, this is on Facebook Live, and you can post questions on the comments section right there on Facebook. And then Wendy will chime in there with some questions throughout the program. And certainly we'll answer as many questions as we can, but maybe with the time constraints that we have, some of those we'll post answers to on social media after the fact. And so with that, we'll go ahead and jump in there and get started. So I am going to share my screen and we are going to go with that. Okay, so what are moles? The mold we have in Indiana is the eastern mole. There's actually several species throughout the country. When you go a little farther east, there's a species called the hairy-tailed mole, a little bit different habitat and look, but essentially a lot of moles are very similar. They're 5 to 6 inches long. They have real dense fur. They look like little kind of chubby bullets in a way. They're active year round, and they only have one litter of about 2 to 5 or 6 pups in a year. And so most people look at these and they think of rodents. Moles are actually not rodents. They're in a different order. They're actually related to shrews. So they're a little bit different in that regard. I will say the one other species we have in Indiana is the star-nosed mole. It's actually an endangered species. If you go out in different parts of the country, it's actually much more common. I know a person in Pennsylvania who works in this area, and their most common yard pest, rather than the eastern mole, is actually the star-nosed mole. But it's very rare to encounter that in Indiana. It's really not found in yards. So these little guys, what's the problem? Because most of the time, if you went out in the woods or a field or something like that, you wouldn't even know they're there. You wouldn't even see any sign that they're there. So what's the big issue? The issue is when it comes to yards is the type of damage that they do through their behavior. And so moles construct pretty extensive underground tunnel systems. And so there's two types of tunnels that they create. One are the surface tunnels, which are close to the surface of the ground. And these can be quite extensive when they're out probing, looking for food items. In Indiana, their primary food source is earthworms, but they also eat soft-bodied insects, grubs, larvae, those types of things, ants. And they're also maybe could eat a little bit of vegetation. When you look at diet studies, that's always like a very small component of their diet. But certainly, if earthworms are present, earthworms is going to be their primary prey item. And so this is an example here. You can see that these there's no really clear tunnel here, but there's certainly a lot of activity. Some people might call this a feeding bed. In other places, you might get more of a linear type tunnel, just like this. This is adjacent to a sidewalk in this case. Oftentimes sidewalks, driveways, patios kind of form a barrier. So a tunnel can kind of meet that and then they'll go off one way or another, and it might follow that barrier for quite some time. So that's something to look for as well. The reason why this is problematic is especially when it warms up, when you get these tunnels, you get this warm air underneath the grass and the roots, and you can get some drying out of that turf. And so you can get turf discoloration, or in extreme cases, death. And so all this tunnel system later on in the year, if you don't roll those back down, you can have issues with that. The second thing, what happens is they form these deeper tunnels. Sometimes they can be 12 inches to 18 inches underground, or even deeper, depends on which part of the country. So if you're in an area that has a really, really deep frost line and moles are there, they're active year round. So they're actually more active underneath that depth, believe it or not. And so I'm going to try and zoom in here on this one. So you can see here that that's a fresh mole mound there. And so what happens is, because they're so deep, that they can't simply just push up that soil like they do with the surface tunnels. And so they actually excavate and bulldoze that soil and push it up to the surface. And so these things grow from the bottom up. And so while these are pretty unsightly, they're not really generally a place you want to do your management, which we'll talk a little bit later. And so in this situation here, some of these mounds or these dirt spots here might have been old mounds that have been mowed over, flattened out by mowers, that kind of a thing. And so you can get some turf dieback when it comes to these mounds. Plus, it's unsightly and it does cause problems from mowing from that standpoint. Okay, so what do we do about it? First, I'm going to talk about what you don't do. Okay, with a lot of wildlife damage things, there's always a lot of information out there that's really not good, and moles is probably the worst. A lot of people have issues with moles, and so there's all sorts of things on the internet or things that people try and sell you. Sonic devices, they don't work. There's no evidence to suggest these things work with moles. There's also a rumor out there, and this has been around for years and years, certainly more than 20 years. I was told by a colleague years ago that she said that this started with the Paul Harvey radio show, where someone or Paul Harvey mentioned that if you fold up juicy fruit gum, put it in the mole runs, they eat it, they become gunked up, and they die. Okay, that doesn't work. That doesn't happen. That's not how it is. Smoke bombs, believe it or not. So you can go on like landscape shop or hardware store, and they probably sell these gas charges, smoke bombs that could be labeled for moles. The thing is, they really aren't effective with moles. The distance those things will cover is about 5 to 6 meters. Mole tunnel systems can be over 1,000 meters, so you're only covering a fraction with one of those. Soil can be very porous, especially close to the surface when you have these tunnels, so you get a lot of escape. So these things, even though it sounds good, they're labeled for that use, they're really not very effective. Okay, so I don't put a lot of stock into these. Other things people have tried is putting like razor blades in the ground or trying to flood them out with water, those kinds of things. It just simply doesn't work. You're wasting your time, and in the case of razor blades and broken glass, it's not safe. It can cause issues, obviously. What are some other things? This would be a category I would call maybe they'll work, maybe they won't. Okay, and it kind of depends. But I wouldn't put a lot of stock into it. Rolling, a lot of people say you should roll your yards. Certainly from an aesthetic standpoint, if you want a nice, even, flat surface for athletic events or just the backyard, if you're out there, you don't want it uneven. Rolling your yard can certainly flatten mole tunnels, which can be a good thing. It is possible you can actually kill some by doing that if they're in the tunnel at the time. But from a standpoint of managing moles, just using that is really probably not going to help you much. Grubs is another thing that you hear out there. So if you just do grub control in your lawn, follow that protocol, you're not going to have any issues with moles. Probably not. Okay, as I mentioned before, earthworms is their primary prey. I mentioned that there's been some diet studies done with moles in South Carolina. There's a recently published study, and it was comparing some South Carolina moles to Indiana moles, and they're looking at stomach contents, that kind of a thing. But the base of the point is that their diets were similar in the types of things they eat, but one difference was they ate a lot less earthworms, probably because where they were at, there was simply less earthworms. So if you're in an area where there's not a lot of earthworms and you're doing insecticide control, then it probably has a better chance of having some efficacy in terms of mole control as opposed to, or I should say mole prevention, as opposed to an area that you have a lot of earthworms that you're not going to impact. So I guess the summary here is you can do grub control, but it's probably more effective to just killing grubs so they're not chewing the roots of your lawns as opposed to mole control. The last thing is repellents. So there are repellents labeled for mole use, and these are like taste and area repellents. Most of these seem to be castor based, and so repellents can move moles out of an area, but the problem is that it's kind of temporary. You're going to have to stay on top of it, and you're really pushing them out from your yard. And if you live in a residential area, you're probably pushing them to your neighbor's yards. And so you guys kind of play back and forth with the mole repellents, I guess, regarding that. So depending on your situation, that may not be a wise choice. So you can try some of these, but by themselves, certainly it's probably not going to be a very effective choice. Which leaves you, what do you do? Before I get into that, I think in the link, Wendy's going to post this website, the National Pesticide Information Retrieval System, kind of a large name. But the thing is that Indiana and many states post their information on here where you can search by state, and then you can look up chemicals or you can look up products to see if they're registered in that state. And so in Indiana, we have no pesticides that are registered for castor oil and those products there, but they are sold in stores. You look in stores and I've seen them there. And so a lot of these things, they're sold because of that. They're called minimum risk pesticides. So I guess what I'm saying is if you see something in a store and you don't see it on the website, it's likely because that's classified as a minimum risk pesticide. Okay. So before I guess I jump in there and talk a little bit about what can we do, Wendy, are there any questions that folks have out there that I can answer?
Sure, Brian. We had a question earlier today on Facebook asking about approximately how many moles can people expect to have on their property?
Okay. Yeah, that's a really good question. And so when you look at, again, some of the published literature, and again, there's not a lot on moles, and a lot of it dates back to the 50s or even the 19 aughts, before World War I. And so you see a number of about 1.2 acres a home range. And so males tend to have a little bit bigger home range than females. But I'm not sure if that's in a more rural setting or different habitat. In a yard, so a typical urban yard is about a half acre. And you can easily have several different burrow systems within that half acre. I've seen backyards that are basically completely overrun with moles. It's almost hard to step in the yard without actually stepping on a tunnel. And so in cases where it's that bad, you basically have to roll it to flatten it out and then try and hit the new tunnels as they pop up with some of these other techniques we'll talk about. But within that tunnel system, you're really only going to have kind of one mole that has it, but sometimes they will use each other's tunnels, except outside of the breeding season. They tend to be a little more territorial when it comes to that. I read an account there where that they actually will kill an intruding mole that comes in their territory during the breeding season. But other than that, they're pretty solitary. So a female in her system, she'll have her pups, and then about a month or so after they're born, she's going to kick them out. So in about another depending on what part of the state you're in, another month or so, you're going to get dispersal from young moles looking for setup. And so sometimes you can have a yard where that time you might get a little pop up here and there, and then nothing really seems to happen. Most likely what happened is one, either the juvenile mole died. Okay, they seem to have about a 50% survival rate. Once they're adults, it's much higher than that. Or two, for whatever reason, they just didn't like the setup. No worms or whatever, who knows, and they moved on. So it's really hard to tell what the situation is, but sometimes you'll see that. And again, that's later on in the summer, typically in June, you'll see that. Let's talk a little bit about what can work, okay? And so there's really four things, and really two of them are probably most reasonable in terms of being able to do it for most people, and that's using traps and then using toxicants, which is a lethal pesticide. You can exclude moles from small areas. Sometimes, the internet's great. You'll get these things where you can make a big mole barrier where you dig down in the grass, 24 inches, 6 inches wide, fill it with stone, and you can, that's your kind of underground mole barrier. They are capable of hitting that and going over it, so I'm not sure that's really effective. That seems like an awful lot of work and things to try and eliminate moles. I think where exclusion would help is like specific situations. For example, maybe if you had a raised bed that you're constructing on soil, not a patio, and you don't want stuff coming up through there, then using something like galvanized 1/4-inch hardware cloth at the bottom of that to prevent access from animals coming up, I can see that as being legitimate. So I think, there's an asterisk by exclusion. It just kind of depends. It has to be a certain situation. The other thing is direct removal. And so when these things are moving in those surface tunnels, you can actually, if you look close, you can actually see the soil move. And you can have a shovel handy and you can dig them up and kick them to the surface. And, some people grab them with a gloved hand, that kind of stuff, or take the shovel and put it in a bucket. Maybe they kill it, who knows? Or some people probably take them and put them out in the woods somewhere away from their house, that kind of a thing, if they don't want to kill it, which is fine. That's their choice. Okay, so direct removal. I've even heard of people, let me see if I got my props here. Oh, it's right here. Okay. So, you've got like a pin flag or something like this. You can put those in the surface runway, sit on your porch, and when the bottom of that's in the tunnel and they hit it, that flag starts to move. you can run out there and get them that way if you don't want to sit there by the chair. So, maybe these days with a lot of people working from home and that kind of stuff, maybe that's something that you might want to try that you didn't think was possible before. But really what I want to talk mostly about are traps and toxicants. Okay. Lots of traps out there. Okay. Victor Out of Sight is a single spring trap. It has levers. I don't have the levers to set it, but it's a pretty powerful trap. The idea there is that the mole would hit that and the jaws would close on it, like this picture right there. There's other traps. This is the mole eliminator. There's several different types and styles of this I've seen out there. Some are metal, some are plastic. It's a pretty heavy trap. This one requires digging to set, okay, and several types to do. This one you actually pierce within the tunnel and then you step on it. Okay, so this bottom plate is flat on the soil surface, and then they hit the pan there, and then it gets them that way. So these are all lethal traps. Okay, different styles. I'm trying to show you some different styles. This one's called the mole or no mole. Excuse me. It's a single spring, and they're sold in pairs because you actually set them in tunnels. So then this you have to dig down in and you set them back to back. So it's a single spring kind of a trap. So you have to compress it. You set it like that and you would put that right into the tunnel. And so the mole would hit that and the trap gets them that way. Okay. And so these are sold in pairs. They also sell levers with these that you can get more of a easier time to set them if you've got a grip problem, arthritis or just weakness in the hand or something like that. That can help you set these kinds of traps as well. All of these traps are set blind. So in other words, there's no bait, there's no lure. You're simply setting the trap in these surface tunnels where the moles are going. Okay. And so you might say, well, how do I know where to set them? And so if you go on the internet, start reading around, and they talk about, setting them in active tunnels, which you certainly want to do, and that's important. And so a lot of people will recommend, like, well, you step on the tunnel and then check it 24 to 72 hours later. Okay, and that's perfectly fine. My preference is always I'm wasting 2 to 3 days trapping by doing that. So I would rather identify long straight tunnels if you can, set the traps in those, and then if you got other potential sites, go ahead and depress them like I mentioned before. You can mark them with a flag, you can mark them with a golf tee, lawn paint, whatever. And then after a few days, if you're not getting what you want in the traps that you have set, check those other spots and see if there's active. You might want to go ahead and consider moving your traps. Okay, that way I think it's a little more efficient and you're not wasting time that way from that standpoint. Lots of other types of trap. The traps that you put in the tunnel, some of these are kill traps. Some of them are actually live traps where it's kind of like an enclosed box trap that's solid. And then you can take the mole and move it somewhere else if you don't want to kill the mole. There's spear type traps that basically similar to the ones that I showed you that you put them right on the run. They hit the pan and the spears kind of come down. They look like basically large nails and they kill it that way. Choker loops, pitfall traps. You can actually take that tunnel, put a jar or something or large can in there and basically cover that up so it's dark and the moles run through and fall in that jar and you can catch them that way. And that would be a live trap that you have to check periodically so you don't kill them that way, obviously. So I guess, the question is which trap is right for you? It really depends on a number of different things. What you find in terms of your ability to set. Some of these things can be a little hard to set. Like any trap, there's always an element of skill. So you always kind of teach yourself over time. Okay, there's a lot of good videos out there on how to set these, but there's no experience that can replace you doing it. And that's one of the shortcomings of doing a program like this. It's really difficult. A couple tips that I think will help you is, especially with these no mole traps, but I think the same is true of these other ones. If you think you've got a mole, pull it out slowly. Sometimes if you pull it out quick, you can actually leave the animal in there and not even realize you caught it. So if you do that, I always recommend that. Scent is always something that comes up when it comes to trapping animals. I always have a set of gloves. Okay. These are old gloves. These are my mole trapping gloves. So all my mole traps, equipment, gloves, they all are in a sack, a bag that I carry. And that's the only thing I use for them. I don't think you can eliminate your scent from things. Animals have a good sense of smell. Moles have really small eyes. They depend on smell for a lot of things. from that standpoint, but you got to be sensible about it. So you want to avoid touching traps with bare hands. If you've got smelly soap that you just washed with or whatever, I think that would not be good. Okay, so you want to try and eliminate that as much as possible from that standpoint. You remember how the traps are set. So if you're wanting to set a trap that's close to right against a patio or a walkway or a driveway, then using a trap like this probably isn't good, because you're going to have to rest this right up on that concrete or asphalt part, and so you may not be able to get it in the ground all the way, and these jaws can't open up all the way. So not every trap is perfect for every single thing. The advantages of the traps that go into the mole tunnel is you can dig down deeper. And so I mentioned before that these surface tunnels, sometimes they may not be there or hard to find. You can find those mole mounds, and sometimes you can probe between them with say a rebar stake. Sometimes you just connect the dots and take a shovel and start digging, and you can find those tunnels in there. And so you can actually set this type of a trap in that situation. You cannot with the trap that functions like this. And so having a couple different types of traps that you use may not be a bad idea if dealing with moles is something that you have to do on a regular basis.
So Brian, we had a question about using the traps. What if people aren't necessarily comfortable doing that? I assume you're going to talk about some other methods. And if you trap one, is it going to deter others, or are they going to just continue to come until you trap them all?
No, so that's a really good question. So there's no evidence to suggest you trap one, then that's it. Oftentimes when you caught an animal in that trap, if you reset it, you can catch them again, catch another animal in that same trap in that same location. I've had people tell me that they swear up and down that they've caught a mole, and I don't recommend people doing this, but this just goes to show you with some of the stuff, people kind of just try things on their own, and whether it works or not, they spread it. But he took a mole and then he nailed the dead mole to the base of a tree, and he swore that smell kept other moles from coming. I don't see why that would. I mean, animals die all the time, and so there's no, yard's pretty big place, and so what would it take for a mole to go to just a different part of the yard or whatever, even if that does have some truth to it. So basically, if you trap, you can keep trapping and move that. Basically, you would do that, and then if you don't catch a mole in 3, 4, 5 days, then you can go ahead and move the trap if you've got other places you think are good to set. If you don't, there's no harm in leaving that trap in there. As long as these are kill traps that you're using, that mole's going to die, and then you just check them periodically. These aren't regulated wildlife. Regulated wildlife, there's a 24-hour trap check law in Indiana and most states. So again, if you're using a box trap to catch a raccoon, by law, you have to check that trap every 24 hours. With these types of traps, you're not legally obliged to do that. It's always a good idea to check them every couple of days, that kind of a thing. But again, some of them, so that's the idea with this one. It pops up so if that trap's been tripped. With some of these other ones that you dig, you've actually got to dig it up to determine that. And after a while, you kind of get the look of how it looks where it's tripped, as opposed to when it's set, that X is gonna have a different shape, if that makes sense. So again, some of these things just kind of come with experience and you figure it out. But moles really don't like a lot of disturbance. So the less you can disturb an area where you're trapping, the better. So try not to keep a mower mowing the area where you have a trap. And so again, the area would be the size of about a hula hoop or a little larger. You wouldn't want to mow that area where you have that trap. Just kind of like let it lie and be real sensitive about that. Some people probably have the experience of having a lot of mold damage in landscaping beds. And so we're not walking around in our beds a lot. And so places where you've got mulch beds or even beds that are covered in ground cover like ivy and those types of things, a lot of times you can have a lot of mold problems in those.
Brian, we have a question coming in from Beva Miller. She wants to know, can any of these types of traps harm dogs or other domestic animals?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It would be difficult for something like this. It's sunk in the ground, it's there. My experience is when you're, say, if you're caught a mole, or even if you haven't caught anything, you want to move it, pulling this up is not an easy thing to do. Okay, could a dog potentially dig around it and maybe get its nose and somehow hit the pan and do that? Yeah, that's a possibility, I suppose. Same thing. with this type of trap. Anytime I set a trap, even if it's something that sticks out, I always flag it, I always mark it. I've got a flag by it. So that way I can tell the kids like, hey, stay out of that area. I got some traps set there. Plus I just don't want them, having a lot of activity around there. I just want it nice and quiet. That's where I want my traps to be. So if you've got dogs and that's a concern, and if you want to use traps, then something like this where it's underground, and even if a dog pinches its nose in there, right, it's not going to be the end of the world. It might teach them not to dig it anymore, that kind of a thing. Some of these more powerful traps, it could kind of hurt them a little more, but to what extent I really couldn't tell you. So if that's a concern, using a trap like this that's underground might be a better option for you. That's a good question.
Great, Brian. And then I guess you're going to talk a little bit more about if people don't want to use the traps, what other methods can they use that might be more dog friendly or kid friendly or whatever?
Okay. So I mentioned direct control. That's probably the most effective thing, where basically you're either out there observing these things. Moles tend to be most active in the morning or in the evenings, but they can be active at any time. I've seen damage pop up in the middle of the night where it wasn't there when you went to bed. It's there in the morning. I've seen damage happen where, for whatever reason, in noon, that's when your traps are going off, that kind of thing. But typically, most of the research says that they're active most often in the mornings or the evenings. Okay. You can try the flag thing in the runs to see if they're moving and go out and shovel them up that way. Okay. So that would be a kid-friendly thing. You can use toxicants. And again, pets, you would have to, that would be a concern, perhaps. There's a couple different chemicals that are labeled for moles. And again, I referenced the website there that these are labeled under. So bromethylene, that's a more a newer formulation. Warfarin's been around for quite some time. But there's been studies to show with the warfarin, for example, years ago, there was a study in a couple places that it showed up to 90% efficacy. So in other words, it eliminated mold damage in 90% of the yards it was in. So they do work. But you'd have to read the label, and these toxicants are actually put within the runway. And so if you read the label, you have the surface runway application, and then you have the deeper runway application where basically that thing's pretty far under. So in that case, I can't imagine be an issue for dogs and pets and kids, that kind of a thing. Even with the surface runway though, a lot of times what I'll do with these is I'll also mark my locations. So when I first tried using these, I always wanted to see if these things were actually eaten. And so I would mark with a flag or even with a golf tee. I would go back a couple days later and dig up that tunnel and see if that bait was taken. Okay, and so if you have them marked and you know where they are, you can try and keep your dog out of that area. But again, that's kind of depends on your situation if that's a realistic option. The other thing you could consider is trying not to let your dog out during the time that you're doing this kind of a thing. And so these things, they only last about 5 to 7 days. They start breaking down, that kind of a thing. So it might be a week or two period where you might be using something like this, or using traps that have a little more bite to them, that maybe you want to just prevent your animals from going in that area during that time. That would be another trade-off that you can make. Good questions.
Brian, it appears we have a few people who tuned in late. Is there anything you mentioned early on that may be applicable to them? We've talked a little bit about the traps and the toxicants, but just general things about Indiana moles and what they can expect in their yard.
Yeah, sure. So the ones we have in our yard are the eastern species. Sorry to do that. So this is a pretty typical: big forelimbs, little eyes, thick hair. Supposedly this hair folds in both ways. It's not like a cat or a dog, and so I guess maybe that facilitates them being able to move underground. But they live they can live pretty long. An age study that I saw had the youngest, obviously the newborns, up to the oldest adult, I think was 7 years, and they used tooth wear and replacement to estimate that. That's a typical way of doing that. But 2 years is a typical age for an adult. And again, the juveniles only have about a 50% survival. But these can be found anywhere. So they can be in woodlands. They can be in grassland areas, and these can be in lawns. We also have a star-nosed mole, which is an endangered species in Indiana. It's endangered because we're on the very fringe of its range. You go in other parts of the country, it's much more common. But in Indiana, you primarily find it in very wet sites. And so you don't really find those in yards and that kind of stuff. So that's really not a concern. But this is what causes the problem, and it causes the problem through its digging, either on the surface like this, or creating these mole mounds from deeper digging that they bulldoze to the surface.
Great, thanks, Brian.
Yep. I think Wendy also posted a couple links to some articles. One I wrote several years back, and another article that was written by Tim Gibb, who's an extension turf specialist at Purdue, that provides some good insight in terms of moles and kind of the, how to work with them.
Another question, Brian, is the difference between moles and chipmunks in destroying your yard. Should people be concerned about killing the chipmunks? Or can they cause the same damage that can be attributed to moles?
Yeah, so there's a lot of little furry things that can call your yard home. Okay, so you have moles, you have voles. So instead of the M, it's a V. Okay, voles. I talk a little funny. That's what my kids say. You can also have shrews, and you can also have other rodents like chipmunks, mice, and those kinds of things, right? And so the rodents, they're all vegetation eaters. They eat primarily plants, seeds, those kinds of things. Obviously, they might eat some insects and things like that to come across them. Shrews and moles are cousins. They're not related to rodents. They're off to themselves. They're what's called insectivores. They eat a lot of insects, that kind of stuff. Although shrews kill moles and other small mammals, or voles and mice and things like that, and other small mammals from that standpoint. So shrews can be good to have around. Shrews look a lot like moles. They are actually have little skinnier noses. They don't have the big forelimbs, and they're like smaller and skinnier, but they look very similar at first glance. But in terms of the damage that a chipmunk can do, so chipmunks can dig up plants. They can dig up in flower pots. A lot of times they'll dig up around newly planted things and feed on the seed part that's still there on that plant. And obviously then it ends up killing that young plant. That they can cause problems that way. They also burrow, and so they have pretty extensive burrow system. So a chipmunk burrow is a little bit different. Typically, it'll go down a few inches, and then it goes off almost at a 90-degree angle in one direction from that standpoint. The other thing with chipmunks is that they try and disguise the entrance to their burrows, and so you'll never see soil and everything out there unless it's a dig out, which I'll explain. But at the actual burrow entrance, they carry that soil and drop it somewhere else to make it less conspicuous. The exception to that is sometimes what you have is like under a porch or a foundation is you'll have a dig out. And so they might dig out some area. A lot of times, like if you pour a concrete foundation, you'll have some type of an underlayment there, and they'll dig out that small gravel and sand-like mixture. And so that's them digging that out, but their actual burrow entrance is somewhere underneath that slab that's not there that you can see. So the difference, it's a little bit different. One of the challenges with moles is that you have this big tunnel system, and then if you've got other little animals like voles that can be quite destructive to lawns, plants that you plant in your landscaping bed, they can girdle trees and shrubs when their bark is thin. Is voles will use these things. And so sometimes people see the mole tunnels and they'll see damage to their plants and they equate the two. Most likely what happened is that you have moles, but then the moles are either facilitating access to those plants and the root systems for voles that are accessing those tunnels, or what's happening is there's some kind of issue there in terms of the raising the soil and everything, and exposing roots to air and having some roots dry out, that kind of a thing. That could be a possibility. The other thing is it could just be a coincidence where you have moles and you have those things, and they're just by coincidence or happen at the same time, and those things aren't related at all. So just because they're there doesn't mean it's kind of a cause and effect thing.
Great, thanks, Brian. Natalie and Brian have both voted confidently for your scissor traps. They both said they've had very good success with those. Someone else mentioned that they have used rat traps in catching chipmunks. Have you heard of that? And is that something you would recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. Rat traps, like mouse trap isn't strong enough for a chipmunk. Chipmunks are actually pretty strong if you're trying to handle them live up at, when we're doing small mammal trapping for classes, things like that, and you're handling a live chipmunk, you actually have to have a handling cone and thing that you put it in to even handle them, because otherwise they're pretty strong. They can give you a good bite. But a rat trap, if you want to use a trap that kills quickly, a rat trap will certainly do that for a chipmunk. Some people they don't want to do that. They can use like a small box type trap that you would catch the chipmunk in that, and then you can move it to another location. But for a kill trap, a rat trap works pretty well. Sometimes what happens is that it's difficult to get the chipmunk to step on the part that you want to do. And so sometimes people have problems with that. A lot of times with any kind of a trap, where if it's a box trap or a snap trap, if you can wall off access except to the part that you want them to walk across, that can increase your efficacy.
Okay, we had another question going back to toxicants. Will a poisoned dead mole, if it is consumed by a dog or other predator, then be transferred to that predator?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a good question. So a couple things is that moles are almost exclusively active underground. So when they eat these, they stay underground. You don't see them. Okay. So unless the second part to that is that that's not going to they're going to break down. So they're not going to be there forever. And so unless you'd have an animal dig them up quickly and consume them quickly, that would be the only way that would happen. There have been some studies done for this kind of a problem, but it's more in terms of a different type of a chemical, some of those slow acting anticoagulants. And so a lot of those things, if you notice, the rat poisons and the mouse poisons, the little granular things, those are almost exclusively labeled for inside structures. And the reasoning is because of what you alluded to there, is that you can get a biomagnification where an animal consumes these things and it doesn't kill them all right away. So they eat a lot more than what the lethal dose is. If they just eat a little, touch it again, they're going to die, but they eat a lot of it. And so if these animals are accessible to birds of, and they're eating a lot of those animals, and that bioaccumulates in those and magnifies in those raptors, and they can actually kill them. There's actually been some studies done in Europe doing that thing. So again, it really goes back to the label, and I can't stress that enough. And sometimes you might think, well, why, if I can use this inside, why can't I use it outside? Oftentimes there's a really good reason why that is. And in this case, with those particular things, they're labeled for indoors because it makes them less accessible for outdoor animals, but also the things that eat them aren't quite as accessible to those outdoor animals. So you're really trying to minimize that risk. Same thing with a lot of things that are put outdoors, they're labeled for underground tunnel use, that kind of a thing. Some of the ones for voles, toxicants for voles, you have to put them in the vole runways. You can't just sprinkle them on top of the ground, although some of them you can, just depends on the label. So I can't stress it enough. Read the label, read the entire label. It has the safety precautions, has the directions, follow the directions.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian.
Yep.
I guess circling back, so say you trap these or you poison the ones that you currently have, what's to keep them from coming back?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. So this is where you've got a couple, they came from somewhere. And so coordinating some type of an effort with neighbors is certainly a helpful thing. But there's absolutely nothing you can do to prevent it. So you are removing an animal and there's a chance that they can come back. Personally, in my yard, I've been dealing with them for quite some time, and I know we've just got some natural areas in and around the house that they're at, and that's probably my source, and I'll probably have to deal with them till here out. I think what can happen though is by staying on top of it, you can minimize the amount of damage. So in other words, it may be coming from a certain direction, and so you always kind of get it at that point. And once you have them in that part of your lawn, you can kind of stay on top of it. That way, maybe they're not in the front lawn at all. Maybe they're only in a backyard or a portion of the backyard, that kind of a thing. So I think that's where an advantage of kind of staying on top of it. It is, but there are no guarantees, right? A lot of the things that we have that are nuisance animals or pest animals or cause damage are because that there's a lot of them and they adapt quite well to the environment that we create in and around our homes.
Perfect. Are there any more questions? Please put them in the comment section on the Facebook chat, and we'll get to those after the session ends.
Yeah, so again, I appreciate folks jumping on here. Sometimes when you do these things, it kind of feels like you're talking to yourself. So I appreciate Wendy working with me, and I actually feel like I'm interacting with another human being. So that's really good. But again, so visit our page on our Got Nature blog. We also have an Ask the Expert, so you can submit questions that way. Facebook and Twitter are other ways that you can ask questions with us. And if I'm not the right person to answer it, we have other specialists in different areas that can answer your questions.
Great job, Brian. And I'm putting the link to our Ask the Expert chat from last week in the comment section for all of you who were unable to join us for that. Brian talks a lot about the difference between moles and voles and those types of other invasive and damaging animals, as well as Canadian geese and other things. So feel free to tune into that and hear a lot more from Brian. We'll have several more of these sessions over the coming weeks, and so stay tuned for those. We appreciate all of you who ask questions, and this will be archived here on our page as soon as this session ends, and also will be available on our YouTube channel within the coming weeks.
Great. Thanks again, and keep those questions coming. We'll talk to you later.